A warning about the widening economic gap. A report says the poor have been left out in the cold and the system only caters to the richest 1%. Is this to blame for many of the world's problems, and what can be done about it? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. It's a trend described as obscene, unfair and grotesque. The world's 8 richest people have the same wealth as half of the world's poorest. That's according to a new report by Oxfam, which says the income gap is widening. The anti-poverty organisation says the wealth of 3.6 billion people is the same as the net worth of the 8 richest men. They're mostly Americans, including Microsoft's Bill Gates, investor Warren Buffett and Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg. Oxfam warns this economic equality threatens to pull societies apart and undermine democracy. This report says people have lost trust in their governments and are no longer willing to accept the status quo, and suggests that may help explain Donald Trump's victory in the US presidential election and Brexit, the UK's vote to leave the EU. So, plenty to discuss here today. Let's bring in our guests now to do so. In London, we have Deborah Hardoon, Deputy Head of Research at Oxfam. In Nairobi, Aly Khan Satchu, CEO of Rich Management and an emerging markets economist. And also in London, Ben Southwood, Head of Research at Adam Smith Institute. Great to have you all with us. Welcome to Inside Story. Deborah, let's start with you. The headline of this report is an extraordinary statistic. 8 men owning half the world's wealth. Just give us an idea of how we arrived at this figure.
Yeah, so this statistic is shocking, and it's an illustration of an economy that works really, really well for those at the top, for the extremely rich who are doing extremely well, and really badly for pretty much everybody else. And we unpack some of the drivers of this in our report, and we look, for example, at the role of the corporations, the private sector, which is very much the engine of economic growth, and look at how those corporations are structured to deliver ever more returns to shareholders, to investors that already have capital and assets. And in doing so, wages of ordinary workers are squeezed, and tax revenues are squeezed as companies seek to avoid paying taxes as far as possible. And this is really creating a widening gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Ben, do you accept, A, that this gap is widening, and B, that it's not a good thing, that it is obscene, unfair and grotesque, as the report states?
Well, I think that the overall presentation we've had from these stats is somewhat confusing and misleading. If you look into the paper, you find that along the world's income distribution, the people in the middle of the world's income distribution have seen the biggest gains over the last 30 years. That's right in the Oxfam paper. They've seen the biggest percentage gains in their incomes. It's the people of India, China, Vietnam and other countries coming into the world market seeing massive income gains. So for example, Vietnam, one we don't talk about as much as India or China, but since they have implemented a bunch of neoliberal reforms in the 1980s, their income per capita has gone up from $100 to $2,000. I would say that the gap is less what we should be focusing on than the welfare of the poor. And there's so much we can still do, but overall, the global economic system is working for them. It's seeing massive increases in their incomes.
Aly Khan, do you agree with that? Do you agree that the current system is working for the world's poor?
If you strip out India and China, if you strip out China, it's a totally different narrative and not such a constructive one. Really, it's China which has lifted millions out of poverty and what is skewing the statistics. I think for the world's poor, unfortunately, what we're seeing is a very Darwinian type of capitalism. The winners take it all, the losers are left with nothing. How we are going to go and address this scenario and make sure that there's better trickle down below is obviously a very, very big challenge. I don't think it's going to happen in the current system. It seems the current system is not concerned with those right at the very bottom. So we've got to look at innovative things that we've seen, cash transfer out of Brazil and other places, as ways to lift up the very bottom billion that you were asking about. But I think what's very interesting for me is that, there are so many losers in this new normal. And particularly in the Western world, where you've seen manufacturing jobs move from the US, from Europe, into China, into Asia. That's what's informed this great new populist zeitgeist. My concern is that this politics of populism, look at what happened with Trump. It's a billionaire's cabinet, is not really going to address these challenges, doesn't have the intention, has cloaked its move into power in this language. But when it comes to policy making, I'm not convinced we're going to see a narrowing of that policy making in the national interest, which is what people need.
OK, I mean, another thing that Oxfam mentioned in this report, Deborah, is that this inequality threatens to pull our societies apart. Touching on what Aly Khan said there, that it's given rise to this popularism, it's given rise to Brexit, it's given rise to the election of Donald Trump. But is this such a bad thing?
Well, I mean, the question is whether or not the economy and the current system is working for people, as your guest said. And it's quite clear that it's not. And if you take Vietnam as an example, we interviewed one from Vietnam who's yes, got an income now because she's selling tea in a hospital, but she suffers from kidney disease and every month is short on paying for the medicines that she needs to keep her alive. The economy is not working for people like one. You know, we interviewed someone called Jane in Kenya, and she's every week paying the council fees that she needs to pay for her market stall, but she doesn't have access to running water or waste collection. And over the street is some of the most expensive real estate in the whole of Nairobi. The system's not working for her either. And in rich countries, indeed in the US and the UK, we know that many people feel like the economy is not working for them and they feel left behind. And that's why we've seen the election results that we have for the presidential election in the US and for the EU referendum here. And it's created real divisions in our society, and that's not healthy, partly because the kind of people that are tapping into this are picking on the most vulnerable people as scapegoats for this crisis that we're living in, that this inequality crisis isn't about the scapegoats that have been picked. It's really about the broader economic system, and what we need is solutions that are more systemic and not picking on people that are immigrants or that are seen as outsiders.
On the other hand, though, I mean, Ben, we've got Donald Trump saying that he is going to bring back more jobs, he's going to break the political elite, he's going to end the lobbying of corporations in government. These are all parts of the unfair system that Deborah is referring to. So is there not an opportunity here to change things and allow more people to benefit from the huge wealth that's been created?
So there are a lot of contradictions there. If Donald Trump is going to bring back jobs, what we've seen so far, his way of bringing back jobs is precisely to give in to corporate lobbying to protect companies from foreign competition. Now, this is completely incompatible with the story we're being told by Oxfam. If in fact it is outsourcing, i.e. sending manufacturing, production and output and wealth to poorer foreign countries that has driven Donald Trump, then that's precisely because other countries in the world are catching up with the growth we've enjoyed. The choice in Nairobi isn't between everywhere being very rich in Nairobi or just some places. It's between everywhere being poor and some places being rich. What we've seen through history is when you get growth, it's uneven, but the rising tide does lift all boats. Vietnam is a good example. You can prove anything with interviews of a small number of people. But if you look at the average income, it's gone up 20 times in the last 30 years. They're still very poor and there's still much more to be done. But that doesn't mean that we have to say the system is failing. That means that we say the system hasn't got there yet. There's no magic bullet. We can't simply magic up growth. Growth is something that takes time. I confidently predict that in 20 to 30 years, Vietnam will be a middle-income country, and later they will be a rich country. It's simply a thing that is taking time.
Is it not the case, though, as the report suggests, that you had, yes, hundreds of millions of people being lifted out of poverty, but so much more could have been done if the system was geared better towards these lower or the lowest income people? And when you look at the system and you look at how it allows things like tax avoidance, then you're seeing countries, entire countries, not benefiting at all from hundreds of billions of dollars.
So there's money around out there. But if you look at the people they highlight in the report, the rich 8, 6 of them Americans. Of those Americans, more than half tech billionaires. What do these tech billionaires do? Did they get their money from government handouts or from corrupt deals that allowed them to take money from society in general? No. By and large, they created their wealth through benefiting people in general. They created their wealth through creating products that people around the world have benefited from. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, mobile phones make a huge difference to normal people's livelihoods by allowing them to know which markets they should sell out for the highest price, by allowing them to send money around and insure against risks. These things genuinely benefit the world, and they're not through the kinds of shady deals that we seem to be having implied. It's true that in some developing countries, corruption is still a big problem, in fact in many developing countries. But these aren't the billionaires we're talking about in the report. The billionaires in the report are the ones who have created wealth for all of us to enjoy.
Aly Khan, do you agree with that, or do you think that tax avoidance is a bigger issue than perhaps Ben will agree with?
I think tax avoidance is a very big issue. I mean, we're talking about, particularly out of sub-Saharan Africa, we're talking about, I think, close to $100 billion a year. And it's not really that subtle. I mean, some of it is actually, it's as if someone's gone in a tuck shop, taken what they wanted, got out, and no one actually catches up with them. So I agree with what Ben's saying. I believe in a meritocratic society. I think if somebody has a great idea like Mark Zuckerberg, then yes, he's absolutely entitled to the type of money that he has made because he's created something. I think where the problem arises, and Oxfam actually drill into this, particularly on the continent, is, these really egregious examples. Take the DR Congo, where you had huge economic value in minerals transacted for peppercorn amounts. And it was blatantly obvious to everybody that you're privatizing state wealth. And I think we have to find where the line is, and then we've got to make sure we draw it and we actually make things count. We are seeing a much more coercive regulatory environment in the West, particularly with the banks. And increasingly, it's becoming more difficult to do some of these very, very smelly, dodgy things, which tend to happen a lot in Africa. But ultimately, we've got to distinguish between meritocracy, between talent, between the right of people to make money where they have a legitimate business, and then on the other side, punish those that are taking advantage of a situation because of their proximity to the president, etc., etc.
Deborah, to follow on from that, is it the issue of wealth itself that's the problem that Oxfam has, or is it the way in which it's accumulated?
It's very much the way it's accumulated and the way that it's distributed and shared. And if you look at people with wealth and assets in the first place, there's enormous opportunity for that wealth to carry on accumulating. You have a position of privilege if you start from a position of wealth and power. And whilst there are strong evidence of corruption and undue influence over policies that affect all of us, with people with wealth and power in companies and at the individual level trying deliberately to influence policymakers to reduce taxes, for example, and shape regulations in the sector that their business is involved in to their benefit. But there's the problems also about the legal forms of corruption, if you like. But the fact that tax havens even exist, that people with wealth and assets can pay a hell of a lot less tax than you or I because they're using things like tax havens. And because within companies it's considered efficient to pay the minimum wages that's possible to pay. This isn't about illegal activities. This is about the way that the economy is deliberately squeezing those at the bottom.
Ben, that's a fair point, isn't it? The top businesses, the main businesses in the world, have simply become too greedy, and we are seeing them squeeze their workers, their producers. We are seeing them doing that in order to deliver ever higher returns to their shareholders. I mean, that's a fair point.
I don't think it's a fair point. I think that we all know that business has always been extremely greedy, and business's greediness hasn't really changed that much. In fact, if you care about stuff like corporate social responsibility, which I don't think is hugely important, but which has grown massively over recent years, then you'd probably say business was getting less greedy. Business has always been greedy, but it pays people higher wages than minimum wage, given that nearly everyone isn't on minimum wage in most countries. It pays people higher wages because they have skills that those businesses want. The point is not to make business moral. The point is to construct good rules in which they don't do anything that's immoral. Now, I don't think that it's realistic to expect businesses to pay people more than they expect they can deliver. But we can create a system where people have skills that mean businesses want to pay them a lot. And that's what we, by and large, have in rich countries. Now, other countries are on their way to this point. The key issue here is that if you look at the world's income distribution, it's the people in the middle of the world's income distribution that have seen the biggest gains over the last 30 years. The people in the middle of the world's income distribution. The Trump-style phenomenon are because people towards the top in rich countries haven't seen as big gains as those people in poorer countries. That's the explanation. It's impossible to believe both that Trump is driven by slowing down growth in rich countries and also to believe that there's a widening gap between rich and poor countries.
Aly Khan, the main point I took there from Ben's answer is that it's not up to businesses to be moral. That's not the capitalist model that our world, by and large, follows. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think, a business has to make money because that's the first point of sustainability. You're not going to be sustainable as a business if you're not making money. So the raison d'etre is, at the end of the day, that they should make a profit. The question is then, making a profit, making an egregious or making a fair profit. And I think increasingly in the 21st century, I'm seeing sort of the leaders of the business world embracing this idea that you have to pay a fair living wage. You have to look at the state of your employees as part of your wider business success. So I think these very extreme examples that Oxfam have picked on in some cases are not really the reality. Businesses, if all your workers are on a minimum wage and deeply unhappy, I can guarantee you're not going to last that long as a business. So I think that is a point I would like to make. But going back to the fact that people in rich countries have made more money, they've been standing still. If you look at the income of people in the middle band across the Western world, it's been going backwards, essentially because a lot of that manufacturing, well-paid manufacturing work has gone to places like Vietnam and China. That's what's made them angry. And I think on top of that, if you look at the trend we're watching amongst this new trend, you're going to we're moving away from globalization, probably into smaller unit sizes. Trump wants to bring all the manufacturing back into the US. We're going to see this kind of thing happening. And I think it's going to compound the problems that we're seeing and not improve them. And I think this sort of divergence between policy making and good policy making is going to be harder and harder to do. Just take Trump and how much he slammed Goldman Sachs. Every single appointment is a Goldman Sachs appointment. So it's very interesting between the rhetoric and the reality. There's a very big divergence, I think, as well.
OK, well, let's just try to throw this forward a little bit. Oxfam says it wants an economy for the 99% of the world and does make some suggestions as to how to get there. It's calling for a crackdown on tax havens and other ways the super rich avoid paying back into society. It says governments need to listen more to marginalised voices and listen less to lobbyists and corporations, which Oxfam says the current system benefits more. It also wants governments to make sure corporations pay fair wages and take responsibility for their impact on the planet. And the report pushes for gender equality, especially regarding access to healthcare and education around the world. Deborah, bearing in mind what we've been hearing from Ben and Aly Khan, which of these suggestions in today's reality are actually feasibly going to happen?
Well, we think they're all feasible. I mean, I refuse to believe that the current system is the best that we can do, and the kind of crumbs that are offered the poorest, most vulnerable people in society is the best that they can get. So all the recommendations in our report are based on what others have been saying for a long time and long-held principles. Principles such as cooperation between countries, that there doesn't have to be a race to the bottom on wages. In Asia, for example, the countries in Southeast Asia are agreeing to an ASEAN-wide, so within those countries in Southeast Asia, to agree a minimum wage. So they're not trying to constantly undercut each other so that multinational corporations can constantly seek the cheapest deal they'll get. We also think that there should be cooperation when it comes to international tax and the existence of tax havens. And this is something that indeed the President of Ecuador is supporting us on, and others have been very vocal. We had a letter from 300 economists supporting the fact that tax havens serve no economic purpose at all. And there is clear arguments for doing some of these international cooperation deals that make it a fairer world to do business and to live in. And there's also things like valuing women's work more appropriately. You know, people who stay at home and look after children, or that do the majority of the domestic care work, are women. And all over the world, this is unpaid, even though it's really critical for our economies and our societies. And we need to rethink how we value those kind of contributions to the world that we live in, and stop overcompensating the CEOs to the tunes of millions every year, and start paying for where value is really contributed.
Okay. Ben, any of those suggestions sound good to you?
I don't mind many of them. I don't think they'll make large differences. One point of fact I want to mention is this race to the bottom idea doesn't seem to ring true with what we've seen in, so the example used was East and Southeast Asia. Over the last 30 years, wages have been going up about 20 times over that period because they're seeing so much industrial growth and so much growth in modern industries there, and because so many foreign firms are investing in those areas. It's just simply not true to say there is this massive race to the bottom. It's impossible to race to the bottom when you're having massive growth like that. We're just seeing massive increases in wages over there. Maybe there are things that are going to make it even better, but before we can even get to that point, we need to start acknowledging that the global economic system is delivering huge growth for the developing world, especially the areas just mentioned.
Aly Khan, we've just got a few minutes left. The World Economic Forum is due to start in Davos. 4 years ago, that group of leaders linked rising inequality to social instability. Nothing seems to have changed. Can we expect anything to come out of this conference this time?
I was just going back and looking at last year's conference, and they missed absolutely everything. If you go and look at what they were predicting and what actually happened, and I suppose that speaks to how unusual a year 2016 was, and what a new set of normal circumstances we find ourselves in. I'm skeptical as to whether these guys are going to produce a silver bullet, but I think what Oxfam has done is clever. It's put top of agenda these very, very important issues which need to be top of agenda. I don't see the determination in this very transactional new US administration, very transactional world, a fortress Europe where the values of Merkel are under pressure. I don't see how this is going to push through. I think it's going to be a very difficult time for the likes of Oxfam to send this up the dial and get real action happening. I think what we're looking at now is a much more national interest type of focus across the world, and therefore people are going to listen to the comments that came out yesterday from Philip Hammond. He's talking about Britain coming out of Europe and then looking at reducing its tax rate. So politically speaking, I think the momentum is in a different direction. It's important these things are raised up and pop over the radar, but I'm not optimistic that we're going to see dramatic change like Oxfam's asking. And I think therefore it's incumbent on countries to look at how they're competing in the world and make sure that they are tooling their people for the best work, for the highest paid work. And finally, that point about women, absolutely key. Women are undercompensated, have a huge amount to contribute, and those countries that unlock that girl power are going to do twice as good as any other countries.
Well, you've made two girls here very happy indeed with that last comment. Aly Khan, thanks very much for joining us. Also, Deborah Hardoon and also Ben Southwood. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, bye for now.